Okay, great. So thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to the ASO expert panel. Today we're going to speak about the ASO of pre-launch. Our selected experts are going to share their experience on how to best prepare for a mobile game rollout. I'm Noga. I'm a senior ASO consultant at StoreMaven. And here at StoreMaven, we help top mobile marketing teams build an ASO strategy. We do that using creative optimization and A/B testing, allowing developers to get a better understanding of user preferences and engagement with the app stores. The idea of understanding users is especially important in the early stages of a game, where users are still discovering the game and developers are still getting to know who their users are and how users are perceiving these new games and what are the aspects that they like best. And yeah, so that's why I think I'm really excited to be here and to hear everyone's experience. So we divided the session into a few different sections. So we'll start by talking about the creative optimization process, and then we'll talk about creating a strategy to ensure high visibility. And then we'll talk about launching in different places in the world. And if we have time, we'll also talk about UA preparations for launch. Please feel free to share any questions you might have in the chat box, and we'll try to answer everything that we see. Otherwise, we'll reach out afterwards to make sure that we answer everyone. Great, so with me today, we have some really special guests. I'll let you guys introduce yourself, and maybe we can start with Lori.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Lori. I'm CMO at AppTweak. I've been with AppTweak since pretty much forever, 2014, back in the old times of ASO, when it was just getting started. And yeah, so AppTweak is the leading ASO tool today. It provides really all the data and insights and features and tools you would need to make sure to make your app and game stand out in the stores. So we provide a set of different dashboards, including ASO intelligence, market and app intelligence, also search ads intelligence. We have a very big focus on keywords. So we have the most complete keyword tool you can find today, with lots of data and features to help you not only research keywords, but also find the best keywords with the right KPIs. And lastly, we provide you with insights and features to help you measure the performance, the before and after of an ASO and keyword update. That is really important today, we know that. And so we work with top mobile app and games and publishers from all the world. I'm here in San Francisco, where we have opened an office a year ago. I've relocated from Brussels, where the HQ is. We also have offices in India and Japan. And yeah, it's been a great journey, and I'm super excited to be here with all of you to discuss how to launch a game.
Cool. So I guess I'll go next. I'm Eric Woods. I've been in mobile for about like 8 or 9 years. I started in journalism before moving over to marketing with GummyCube, which is an ASO agency in San Jose. So worked on a lot of great AAA titles there. Left after about 2 years to come down to LA, worked at Jam City, where I supported Cookie Jam, Panda Pop, Emoji Blitz, launched Harry Potter, Hogwarts Mystery, Vineyard Valley, and Frozen Adventures. And now I'm working with MobilityWare, where I'm primarily working on Hearts, Addiction Solitaire, and Klondike Solitaire.
Cool. Oh, I think Carson's joining as well, maybe. But I'll go first. I'm Eric Troy. I'm an associate ASO manager at Jam City. Eric Woods was kind of my predecessor here. I think all of us work pretty closely in proximity. I worked with Noga at StoreMaven really closely, Lori at AppTweak. Essentially here, I manage a lot of our titles such as Harry Potter, Hogwarts Mystery, Disney Emoji Blitz, and a handful of others. I haven't been with the company too long. I think it's been about 6 months. But before this, I worked at NBC Universal in mobile games as well. And prior to that, Amazon doing strategy work.
Great, thank you. And we might also have Karsten Davis joining in. And he's a performance marketing manager at MobilityWare. And here he is.
You made it.
No, but I think we still... Can we hear you? I think the mic is having some issues, maybe.
Almost there.
How about now?
Yes.
Great.
There you go.
Wonderful. Okay, of course, we planned to meet early and technology decides to explode like it always does. But, you know, when there's a will, there's a way. Apologies for the late arrival. But, yeah, you know, the beauty of working
just
from home.
In time.
Yeah, the beauty of working from home. Yeah, so my name is Karsten Davis. I'm a performance marketing manager over at MobilityWare with Eric. I actually know a lot of these fine folks from my time back at Nexon M. Rest in peace, up in the Bay Area. Working on some awesome sort of AAA titles up there, including things like Dominations and Marvel Battle Lines. But yeah, definitely have some great experience in ASO and happy to share knowledge.
Awesome. Great. So I think we can start to dive in right into the questions. So first we'll talk about the creative optimization process. And the first question is, what are the different steps of preparing to market a game before it's launched? So at StoreMaven, we categorize the process into three different main stages. The first one is concept testing, then we have soft launch, and then hard launch or global launch. I think I can hear myself twice. Okay, so I'll talk briefly about each of these stages because each of them has its own individual goals. And obviously, guys, whenever you have an experience or something to share, jump right in. So starting with the concept testing phase. In this phase, we're really trying to evaluate between different game ideas. So we're using the App Store to test different concepts, but we don't actually care about having a fully polished App Store page. We're just trying to make sure that the messages come across in order to understand if this is the right game to develop at this point. This process is also kind of a series of tests that are kind of accompanying the game in its development phase, and the goal is really to help make better product decisions on how the game will look eventually. Eric Choi, maybe do you have anything to add about the concept testing phase?
Definitely. I think concept testing, more than any other step in the product lifecycle, is probably the area of ASO testing that has the most potential for repercussions, because it's so early on. Any decision that you kind of rabbit hole down that isn't proper, you have a high chance of just going down a hole of less profitable and leaving something on the table, or just not profitable at all. So I think in concept testing, more than any other phase, it's really important to make sure that you have clear questions that you're trying to answer, and that the creative and targeting that you actually have are only trying to answer that one question at a time. I think in a lot of other phases of testing, you're able to take larger swings with kind of a lot of moving variables, because really you're concerned about getting increases in conversion rate and installs. And you can kind of backtrack and figure out what caused that at a slower rate. You'd rather just capture that first. But in concept testing, you're influencing product decisions, like you said. You're influencing the entire direction of the game, art style. So it really requires you to kind of break it down and go step by step. So it's a larger phase process and requires a lot of thought and planning. So you need to get started earlier than maybe any other phase. Another thing I'd like to mention is that, like, most times in concept testing, you're going to be testing things like you just mentioned, game mechanics. Other things are like art style, but they shouldn't be tested at the same time, in my opinion, simply because there's too much noise at that point, and you really don't want to dilute your results at any point here. So once you have, like, I'll give a hypothetical example. If we're looking at launching a puzzle game and we're only looking at two options based on competitive research, one option is a very simple collapse game without much meta elements. Another option is a puzzle builder game where you complete puzzles to maybe build a house. They might have different ARPs and different monetization potential, but really what you're trying to measure for ASO is consumer interest. Is one more appealing to consumers than the other one? Or does one stick better with that target audience than the other one does? And so once you have those storefront variants created, I think a big part that is overlooked is kind of the audience and targeting in terms of driving traffic to those tests. And it's difficult in concept testing because not all publishers or developers have like a wide portfolio where they can pull lookalike audiences for similar games. And so at that point, you're really going to have to work with Facebook interests, Facebook audience targeting, anything that you have accessible to you to create an audience that you think will be indicative or as closely representative of future traffic that you'll have if this game were to launch. And so really making sure that that is spot on is going to be the most important thing, because at the end of the day, if you don't target correctly, none of these test results matter. And so it's really important that if you are targeting like the puzzle builder, then you target the puzzle builder audience. If you're targeting the collapse puzzles, then you're targeting peer groups from those similar types of games. But you might also want to target a larger audience of puzzle gamers in general or mobile gamers in general to see if there's any cross-play potential or which one has the broadest appeal. The downside of that is that every time you add another layer like that in terms of audience targeting, there is more to compartmentalize and really dissect. Having access to all that data is great, but you really, when you're setting up these tests, you should map out the entirety of the decision tree. Make sure that, you know, if I land on this node and this mix of results, what will my next step be? Because in concept testing and soft launch testing in specific, everything's going to be moving at a really rapid pace. Deadlines can always move up. Product KPIs might work out well, so you might have to go earlier. And so you really just want to make sure that organization and planning takes precedence over everything else.
Great. And I know that a lot of developers also like evaluating between different concepts from the impression to the install phase, especially because of what Eric just mentioned about targeting a specific group of audience on Facebook and then seeing the performance from the ad till the install. So really looking at the entire funnel. Aina asked, what tools are you using for concept testing? So I have to say you can definitely use StoreMaven for that and to create landing pages that will act as the App Store, and you can see many different metrics on user engagement and eventually install. Okay, so after actually one more thing to mention about concept testing. I think Eric, maybe you want to talk about that as well, but it's the surveys.
Right.
So whenever, do you want to take
Sure. Yeah. StoreMaven has a really great function where you have built-in surveys. And in concept testing, obviously you don't have an actual product to lead people to most of the time. So what you'll do is you'll lead people to surveys where you're asking very pointed questions about what you're trying to answer. For instance, are they interested in specific game mechanics more than others? Are they likely to monetize? And of course, this is all going to require some strategic thinking in terms of how to word it. But when it comes to surveys, something to keep in mind is that all of that is going to be self-reported data. And I'm sure all of us have taken surveys or maybe even the same survey multiple times and just put different answers. And so what should always take precedence there is behavioral data, and trying to make your surveys also have as many behavioral data points as possible as opposed to self-reported data. And so what that means is we have the strongest source of behavioral data in terms of the actual click-through test itself. We have clicks on the UA ad to see if people were interested in that to begin with. And then once they get to the mock landing page, we have the installs there to see people's interest. And that should take precedence over things like, I like this game a 5 out of 7 or something like that, which provides a nice secondary color, but should not be your primary decision-making metric. And so in terms of your survey itself, ways that you can incorporate more of those behavioral metrics is by including, rather than do you prefer puzzle builder to puzzle simulation to simple puzzles, you can show 3 different pictures of the actual gameplay and say which of these is most appealing to you, and trust that click data more so than the self-reported data itself. And so yeah, that's kind of surveys in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. The next phase is soft launch testing, where usually people start with the core messaging just to check the general appeal in different audiences. Following that, still in the soft launch, you usually have messaging optimization. So you take whatever worked in the core messaging test and you try to flesh it out. And lastly, you'd probably want to test out the App Store layout. Once you have the core messaging, you want to check what works best in terms of conveying these messages: portrait versus landscape, video versus no video, where to place the caption messaging, etc. And then following that phase, we have the hard launch, and we include this still in the pre-launch because a few weeks after the hard launch, there's kind of like another small launch, or actually not that small, but usually after 2-3 weeks after the game is launched, we see a sharp CVR decay. And this is generally because in the beginning, you really get the core audiences, the core fans into the game. They discover the game and they decide if they want to download. And the messages that work for this core audience might not be the same messages that work for a larger type of audience. So that's why after 2-3 weeks, it's important to prevent the CVR decay by taking a step back and reevaluating the messaging that you put in the live store. Okay. So this was the different steps in pre-launch. Moving on to another question, how do you find the top value propositions of a game before launch? Eric Woods, you want to share your experience?
Yeah, sure. So really, I think there's like multiple steps in finding the key value propositions that you're going to want to ultimately put in front of that really qualified group of users that Noga was just talking about. For me, the first step is really just jotting down every value proposition that I can think of that the game would deliver, and everything that the product team can think of that they're trying to speak to. There might be specific values or features, for example, that those teams are hoping that you can kind of translate to the market. And then the next step, I think, would be exhaustive competitive research. This is something that really should be ongoing, not only throughout soft launch, but also throughout the whole life cycle of the game. But basically, do some research, figure out which KSPs your competitors use, especially if you know that those competitors are actively testing, because then you can kind of gain an understanding that, okay, my competitors have already found these concepts or these KSPs to work, so I'm going to kind of star those and keep them in mind as I test. And after collecting all of that info, I like to figure out which KSPs specifically are actually going to move the needle on conversion the most. So this would usually be actually the last step of my pre-launch test process, or pretty close to it. But basically, after running several rounds of, like bigger hypotheses, I will drill down onto specific things like what order you show the KSPs in your screenshots or in your videos. So that would literally just be testing what order you're showing your screenshots in. Let's say you have 2 KSPs for a casino game, for example, and one of them is get 1 million free coins when you install, and the other one is like daily jackpots, and you want to see which one converts better. You can test using each of those in the first screenshot placement to test the first impression and see which one ultimately has higher conversion.
Great, thanks. And the next question is how to test creatives before launch. Anyone wants to add on that? I think we covered a lot of it already.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of it. I think the only thing I would add here is that, especially in the launch phases, a lot of elements of the game are like really held dear by everyone in the company, right? Like we have an idea of how you want a game to be when you first start doing it. But when you start testing things, the results might tell you to tweak certain things that you really like about the game as someone on the actual side of the developer or the publisher. And I think something that's really important throughout the testing process and throughout iteration and optimization is that you really shouldn't hold anything sacred. And as long as you're setting up your tests very well and vetting everything and making sure this is really indicative of true performance, then you should trust that data, right? Or else why are you setting those tests up? And so I think that's something that is difficult for all of us, and it's probably always going to be difficult. But incorporating that early on is, I think, one of the best ways to make sure that you're getting a product to where it needs to be as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I really like that statement, and I definitely agree with that. I would add one other thing onto that as well. Speaking to the soft launch testing process, and just say like your testing strategy in general will kind of depend on how much time and how much marketing budget you have to allocate. And so, for example, the ideal testing cadence would be you have your launch date that's kind of set in stone, and then you back into a schedule that allows you to ideally test at least the icon screenshots, video, and Google Play feature graphic one time before you launch. Testing can sometimes go a little faster with more budget because you're acquiring more users to drive to the test. So that's where the budgeting fits in. And having a strong hypothesis is also kind of an important element of this too, because if you have a hypothesis that's very specific, like for example, let's say you have like a match 3 game and you think users are going to install this game because they want to train their brain or complete challenges. And so you put like a brain in the icon. That's a strong hypothesis, whereas saying like users like blue, so I'm going to make the icon blue, doesn't really tell you anything about the user at the end of the test, aside from a very transparent fact. So having those strong hypotheses helps it go faster as well.
Definitely.
Great. And the next question is how to extrapolate learnings from soft launch to other countries. And I can take that if anyone else wants to go before that. Okay. So I think the first thing is to look at other games in the portfolio that you have launched in different countries that you have hard launched already. And you can look at the similarities in their performance between the countries that you're soft launched in and the countries that you want to apply the learnings to. That said, I think it's very difficult to say that if one thing worked in one country, then it will work in another country. It's always case by case. There are some countries that have shown similarities to the US, like South Africa. So a lot of times we test in South Africa to get a proxy to the US, and the Philippines also, but in some of these countries that are a proxy to the US, we see that the phone device mapping would be different, and so you can overcome that with a specific targeting.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that.
Ahead.
Definitely, when you're getting ready to sort of extrapolate things, make sure you're double checking that your geos do have similar performance to the US. Even something like a Canada and Australia, where there's about a 30% discrepancy, is a really good indicator of what's actually going to perform once you get to sort of your key territories. Or if you have a game that's not necessarily centered for the US, let's say you're targeting more Asian markets, matching something like a Taiwan to Korea and Japan before you go sort of wide gives you a better idea of how you're going to perform as soon as you hit to sort of maximize things like featuring and that day one burst.
Yeah, definitely. And what Noga said earlier about the kind of that hard launch being a second soft launch, this kind of plays into it, because a lot of times when you're soft launching, you're not doing it in your main target geos. And so you're gonna, in most cases, I think, you're gonna have to retest that pretty much right after launch, at least at small scale, or maybe separate from your actual live traffic via like StoreMaven or something, just to validate that the test results are actually gonna hold.
Great. So I think we can move on to discussing creating a strategy to ensure high visibility, and I'll hand it over to Laurie.
Yes, sure. So I think this is a big topic, obviously, very excited to get it covered. We're going to discuss keywords, essentially. Before diving into the whole keyword aspect of ASO, which is obviously extremely important, I wanted to address the category and subcategory topic here. Obviously, when you have a game, you have to pick a category, and in the games, you can choose a subcategory. And we know that games can fit sometimes in multiple categories. So that's also something you have to take into account and not overlook. Choosing a category, a subcategory is extremely important because it can have a lot of effects on your impressions and download rates. Not only direct effects, but also indirect effects, right? So I really wanted to highlight here a few points. We've seen that the category you place your game in has a great impact on browse, not only because users can find your app in a specific subcategory or your game, but because it affects the similar games that will point to your app, right? Or to your game. So here it's extremely important to take that into account. We've seen a client actually change the category of their game, and other games were pointing to theirs. That made more sense, that were more relevant towards what the game was doing. Another good point here is that subcategories impact the keywords visibility, right? So we've seen that as well. Place in another will have some impact on your keyword visibility. So for instance, if you're hesitating between cards or board, and you want to maximize your visibility on keywords around cards, well, then it's a no-brainer. You should probably go for the cards category, and you would expect some increase in visibility around that semantic with keyword cards. So it's also extremely important to look at the competition, obviously. So you want to know what your competitors do. You want to know where they are, and you also want to evaluate the competitiveness of the category. We have a cool tool on AppTweak that lets you know how many downloads you need to reach a certain top in a specific category in a country. So that can be interesting insight to kind of set yourself a budget for your ad spend, for instance, or just to set yourself some goals. Okay, we need that many downloads to be in the top 3 for that category. And of course, it differs according to the competition. So that's very important to take into account. So I don't know if you have anything to add on the category or subcategory selection here. Maybe one last thing is that you can obviously test and make a change as you go. We see that a lot. But of course, when you do a test, you should make sure that you measure the right KPIs and that you don't look at too many different things to be sure that the change in category is the explanation of an increase or decrease in impressions.
Okay. I think we had a few people ask about what is soft launch exactly. So do one of you want to just quickly address that?
Sure. So for a lot of studios, before a game goes basically to a grand launch or a worldwide launch, they will open up the game in certain smaller geos to do testing around internal goals and like tech testing to make sure the game is stable and actually performing before it sees worldwide. And they put significant marketing dollars behind it. So for a lot of companies, you'll start with something small like Oceania, Philippines, or Singapore for tech, and then you'll move towards the Nordics, so your Norway, Swedens, to make sure that your game's actually retaining users. And then you'll go into some of your larger geos, your Canadas, your Australias. Singapore can also work here too because they tend to monetize well, to check the monetization of your game. And once you're sure at those 3 signposts that the game's actually performing like you want it to, you can then go ahead and go to a worldwide launch where you would hit your Great Britain's, US's, Japan's, China's, sort of these major geos where you're going to get most of your profits from because you don't want to flood the market with games you're not necessarily sure about. It also helps with platforms because platforms want to see you have due diligence before they may consider you for something like featuring or for extra marketing support on their end. So it's just a good sort of sanity check on your game before it goes to live.
Yeah, and during the soft launch, you can also test your category, right? And you can see how it performs. And to answer to Megan, yes, most of the tips that we're talking about today and tactics can apply to apps as well, not just the games, obviously. So yeah. I guess the next important topic is obviously everything related to keywords, and I know we have a lot to say in that area. So let's start with what type of keywords to target as you're launching a new game. Sure. Eric, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're looking at keywords to target for a new title, the number one thing is that they're relevant, they're feasible to achieve, and have a decently high search volume. Decent can kind of depend on the scale of the game and the scale of the marketing team that you have. But when you're looking from Apple's standpoint or Google's standpoint, Apple will take into account a few dozen factors for their search algorithm. But some of the most important are actually install velocity. So basically, how many installs did you get yesterday or last week? How many installs are you getting today or this week? And is it more or less, and by how much? So that's install velocity. And DAO. So UA and marketing are actually kind of the best ways to drive scale on those metrics. So those things will have a really huge impact on the keywords you can target. So just keep that in mind. For larger companies, the UA budget will fairly closely correspond to how aggressive you can be on keywords. So just keep a really close eye on the projected UA budget and just try to keep it in your mind, I guess. Smaller teams, on the other hand, should definitely look for keywords that are really relevant, but maybe a little less competitive and maybe even a little bit lower volume. You don't necessarily need to have a super high volume keyword if you're not going to even have a chance of ranking for it. It can be a lot more helpful to have like a 10 volume keyword, but you're number 1 or number 2, than to have like a 50 volume keyword, but you're rank 80 and nobody's ever going to scroll down that far. So I guess the last thing I'd say on that is just competitor brands. A lot of people love to target competitor brands in the keywords. When I was first starting out in ASO, everybody really wanted to target Candy Crush super badly. And I was always like, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's like 5,000 apps that are targeting Candy Crush, and it's very, very hard to rank for that game. So competitor brands, I find, generally make up a very small portion of installs. So I'd recommend going super relevant and super feasibly achievable if you do decide to target those.
Yeah. Can I play a little devil's advocate to Eric real quick?
Sure thing.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say also about competitor brands is if you have a brand, so if you're working with a larger brand or something that has some panache or already sort of built goodwill, don't be afraid to target competitor keywords and branded keywords, because that's when you can really compete and sort of move up those ranks. If people think about X brand and also think about your brand or whatever group you're working with, then go ahead and target it. It could be a big win for you. You know, that sort of rising tide lifts all boats. But if you don't, then yeah, that's where that sort of advice comes in of you may want to steer clear of these, because it just gets so competitive and so sort of red ocean down there at the bottom that it's really hard to sort of come float to the top.
Yeah, totally agree on that, Carson. Just maybe to clarify, not to target trademark terms, of course, and branded terms. That is something you have to be careful about. Obviously, more and more games use generic terms as their brand terms, so you can obviously use them, but you have to be careful when using exact trademark terms, right? Yeah, definitely agree with Eric. You have to start slow if you're a smaller publisher and focus on conversion and relevancy of keywords instead of focusing directly on high popularity keywords. Definitely more important to try to target being in the top 10 for keywords, even if they're less popular, than to be completely invisible on highly popular keywords. So it's really important to take that into account, and then gradually, as you grow, as your game grows, you'll be able to target more and more popular terms. So that's a very important point. Now, speaking still of brands and keywords here, we see that a lot when you have a game that is like worldwide. You sometimes have, and actually very often have to choose, to have this trade-off between your branded English terms versus localizing those terms, right? And choosing the local titles. And so we see that in some cases, it's better to keep the actual English version of your brand and localize it, internationally. But in some other cases, it's preferable to actually use the localization and the right terms for locals, right? That's something we see very, very often. And I just quickly wanted to highlight that. We've seen, for instance, for one of our clients, a puzzle game in the Nordic countries. It made absolutely no sense to translate their puzzle brand terms into the local regions, because simply and purely everyone was using puzzle and typing puzzle. And so to confirm that, you absolutely have to do your research. This is, probably how you can get the answers. Should you or should you not localize your titles and keep your English branded terms? well, do your research, right? So you should first obviously check what your competitors do. That's always great to do, to see a little bit how they do and in which country they do it. But most importantly, you want to research how English is being used, or how your original language is being used in those countries. You can check on tools like AppTweak the search popularity of those keywords in each country. So that's extremely interesting, is to see how, for instance, puzzle, the English term, would do in a Nordic country, and you can have the popularity of that English term in that country, which will be different than in other countries, of course. So you really want to do your research and check the keyword search popularity country by country. So you really have to do your research country by country, and you can have a different strategy according to countries. So I don't know if anyone has anything to add on this straight up. No.
Not in terms of English.
Okay. So I guess we can go to the next question and topic. We know that when you launch your game, you benefit from a boost from the algorithms, and because you would also put a lot of effort in UA, whole boost in downloads, but the natural boost of the app stores and the algorithms is extremely important. And I'm curious to hear what are your thoughts on how to maximize the keyword visibility during this launch and this boost.
I guess just kind of simply, just like burst UA at launch. That's always going to help. But then I also like to start with the more competitive or difficult to achieve keywords if we're going to be bursting at launch, because that's going to give us more velocity and more volume to actually achieve those keywords. And then the only other point is, I guess, hopefully you would have soft launched at this point, so you can have an understanding of how the networks are responding to your game and how they're picking it up, and what kind of scale would be feasible to achieve. Yeah, I think burst at launch.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was gonna say the other thing is, if you can get a feature, definitely get a feature, because that's just a ton of free organic installs that are going to help you burst at launch, especially with your blended CPMs, and also that larger influx of traffic through the store, be it through browse and through a lot of people seeing it and then searching it later, also helps drive relevancy on those keywords that allows you to sort of move up those charts. And one thing a lot of people forget about is your secondary marketing activities, things like PR, things like influencers. All that sort of stuff generates search traffic for you. Sometimes there's direct links. Sometimes people are watching a stream, forget, and then search later. All of that helps you get more keyword velocity as you launch.
Definitely. Yeah. And to back up, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
To back up Eric's point about targeting kind of the more difficult ones at launch, when you have like the featuring that Carson said, and of course the UA push. If you don't start ranking highly on those keywords, you kind of know what your upper limit is early on, and so you can rapidly iterate and start targeting the ones that you can actually start ranking in top 5 on. So it's probably like the single most impactful learning period that you have in terms of keyword targeting. So make good use of it if you're planning on getting that push.
Yeah, 100% agree on that. Also wanted to highlight and insist on the relevancy of keywords, right? Yeah. You don't want to, even if you have an increase in rankings, very high popular keywords, but that really don't relate to your game or not so much, well, that could actually penalize you, because the conversion will be so low that it will not help. So make sure, obviously, that you choose relevant keywords, and extremely relevant keywords. Yeah, so there's also a whole other topic here that is really, really frequent. We hear that a lot. It's installs cannibalization. So I believe that here as well, it's an interesting discussion. So when we talk about installs cannibalization, we can see it both ways. You could have the cannibalization between paid and organic, right? So when you are bidding on your own brand and you are, taking away some organic downloads from your own game through paid. And there is also the cannibalization between your portfolio games. So that is, in just organic search results. So that is when you have, for instance, all the Candy Crush games or Rovio, Saga, Angry Birds. You would, for a specific set of keywords in the search results, you would have only the games of one publisher, likely in the top 5 or 10, right? Or at least they will be very present. And you come to a point where sometimes you're actually competing with your own games, right? And so I'm really interested to hear a little bit your thoughts on that. Maybe Eric, if you want to add something here.
Sure. So I guess my first thing to couch this in is that I would always rather have users convert into my ecosystem than a competitor's ecosystem. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from initially. But there are a couple of different ways of looking at it, like you said. So for organics, you can potentially block and tackle. So that's what you were kind of speaking to, Lori, about like Angry Birds owns the top search results for all of their key terms, their key games. Or, you know, if you search for Candy Crush, it's mostly King games. So like, I guess the hypothetical example there is like, let's say I'm Scopely and I just launched Scrabble and we're getting a lot of traffic and a lot of attention. Competitors are coming in and bidding on me, et cetera. So I want to block them off. I would target Scrabble Go in the keyword banks of my other games. And Apple would usually give me priority because Scrabble's my game. Right. That strategy has some cracks. So like if you checked Candy Crush a couple of years ago, it would be literally 15 King games in a row before you would see a single competitor. If you search for it now, you'll see like Toon Blast and Gardenscapes and a few other games have started breaking through. So it's not necessarily an airtight strategy. It's not something that I would make like the foundation of my whole strategy. But like I said, I think it's still a good practice to get into blocking, at least for the largest game that you have with the smaller games that you have. That way, if the user scrolls down, if they don't have super high intent and they're not necessarily intent on installing the first thing they see, they still have a chance of converting into my ecosystem and not into a competitor's. You also spoke to paid, so I'll speak to that a little bit before I let it go. I've seen that certain companies, and working with a lot of companies, certain ones will split that into a brand strategy versus a UA strategy. Scaling App Store ads up all the way to compete with your competitors won't always be profitable from a ROAS standpoint, and you'll definitely have some cannibalization if you're doing that. So the other way of looking at it is as a visibility play, something like taking out a billboard or like a Subway ad. You'd file it under the same type of spend because you're basically keeping your game top of mind for consumers by bidding so heavily instead of targeting like a great ROAS. It's an interesting strategy, which is not right for everybody. So I'm going to say that right away. But if you're an enormous company that doesn't necessarily need every source to be ROAS positive, that can be an interesting alternative way to think about it.
For sure. And I think Christopher just asked a really relevant question that I think you already kind of answered, but I'll just read it if anyone wants to add on to that. So if you have a bigger brand and feel there's a good chance that you'll receive support from Apple and Google, would you still recommend spending on day one? Or would you be spending for installs you would likely get organically? I think what you said about visibility kind of covers it, but does anyone want to add on?
Yeah, I would also add in that you still want to spend day one because growing that golden cohort isn't really a bad thing. Again, those are the users that are going to sustain your game for most of its lifetime, if not all of its lifetime. So it'll be your most engaged users going to stick around the longest. Again, adding people to that, even if you would maybe get them through something like a banner feature, still helps out. You just don't want to miss those downloads when you know you're still top of mind. The network's going to be super interested because the game's new and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
You only get one launch. Yeah, so really try to capitalize on that.
Definitely. But yeah, just to go back on the roadblock strategy, because it has a name for it, right? The roadblock strategy when all your games ranking for the same terms. I believe that this strategy also does work, but as you said, in some cases, and especially for similar games, obviously, right? So as you said, with the search intent, it still matters. So if you're looking for a puzzle game, you want to end up downloading a puzzle game, right? So you will want to do that with similar games. That's a very important point to highlight here. And of course, I would also say that it is nevertheless still important to kind of differentiate those games, even if, obviously they're similar and they're in the same keywords. And there, it's really interesting to actually use your creatives to do so and to show, okay, this game is actually the same but different, right? Because it has this whole new universe or those different features. And so you want to maximize the creative, I guess, to show the difference between your games, but at the same time make them fall under the same sort of type of games, right? Similar games. So yeah, definitely agree that it really depends case by case. And for the paid versus organic cannibalization, we've recently seen and read about it a lot. And usually we see that cannibalization is bigger on the Play Store compared to the App Store. That's good to know. And definitely you have to make sure that the CPI is still worth it. And when you do that approach, and once again, it works better with similar, for sure.
Cool. So, guys, do you want to add anything on what we discussed, or should we move on to answering some questions because of time?
I'll just add one last thing about the last point about cannibalization. If you are doing a paid search ad on an organic term that you're likely doing highly for, don't just look at the paid ROAS in that case. You should really be looking at blended ROAS, which is kind of like you're gonna have to manually calculate a lot of stuff. There's no like true way to calculate it simply because you're not paying for the organic. But a simple way you can do it, of course, there's more sophisticated methods, but if you just take the organic RP and kind of incorporate that as the numerator and then use the actual spend that you're getting for the paid ad, then you have somewhat of a blended ROAS right there that can give you a better read on whether you're actually improving the performance of the app as opposed to letting a competitor take that top spot in terms of ASA or app search ads.
Totally agree.
Great. Someone asked, how many organic downloads do you get from getting in the top 10 of your category chart usually? Anyone wants to take that?
Well, it depends. And tools like AppTweak can provide you with this answer. So it really depends on the category. Yeah, I guess you're more than welcome to come check it out on AppTweak.
Great. And Amy asked, so how do you get featured? I can say someone answered already. You get connected, or you are connected. But I can also add on to that and say that Apple and Google, first of all, they say it upfront that they want you to have a video in the store. And if you don't have a video, then you're likely to get featured less often. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is we noticed that Apple and Google really like it if you use kind of their features. So if they kind of just launched the possibility to incorporate AI and AI in games, and your game is using it, then you might get featured in that special placement for that purposes. I think that's it on my side. Anyone wants to add on that?
Yeah, one thing to add is that as of, I want to say 2017, they have opened a direct sort of like submission portal for featuring, where you can actually put in all of your information and add sort of what you're using, what you're not using. But also a big thing they like is stories. Like if you have a cool story about your game, if you have interesting stories from your devs about how the game came to be, that's a really good thing to leverage, because Apple, especially with the Today tab, is all about writing stories and sort of highlighting cool stuff going on in the industry. So leverage the cool stuff you're doing to help you get a chance to get featured.
Yeah, if you can help them with their jobs, they'll really appreciate that. And then I guess one last thing too is if you bring them numbers, that's another thing that they really appreciate. So like hard estimates of how many users you're going to drive, how much budget you're going to spend, that kind of thing. Any review scores from soft launch, like that's always helpful.
Yeah,
just shows them that the game is serious.
I would also add to take seasonality as your advantage, right? So if you have something to offer that goes along with seasonality, you can also get higher chances to get featured during specific months, for instance, or a specific period of time. Make sure that you build up a great story to reach out to them, and you'll likely get more featured as well.
Great. Aina asks, would you recommend running a name test for your next game? How would you do it? So from on my side, 100%. The name, even though you can change the title, the name is something that will really accompany the game throughout its life. And it has really large implications. It will appear anywhere the game appears. So definitely test out different concepts, see how they perform for different audiences, and check what users feel with hearing different names and what game they expect to see for the name that you're testing out.
Yeah, and I would speak to that a little bit more in terms of like the execution of how to do it. There's like one very straightforward option of like having 2 landing pages where everything looks the same in terms of like icon screenshots, and you just change the title. Mm-hmm. That's a big change for us for like creating the game, but for the user, a lot of times it's not something that's going to be materially impactful and like really impact CVR. So I think a really solid way of testing names, and what we've done before, is creating statics and like actual marketing materials with the logos and stuff, and just having simple click-through tests on those. Because again, going back to the concept testing, the behavioral data should trump everything else. And so in that case, having those statics, actually observing the click-through rate, seeing if it's statistically significant, and then moving forward with it at that point. And just making sure, of course, from the keywords perspective, incorporating ones that you really want to rank on is strong as well.
Okay, I think one last question maybe. Angelina asks, how long should you launch, or how long should the launching stages last for hyper casual? Anyone has experience with that?
I wouldn't say it's like specific for hyper casual. I'm sure there are commonalities, but in general, for the soft launching, you want to make it time bound first of all, and really try to hit KPIs within a certain time period, or else you're really stretching it out. Market's going to be changing, and if you're not hitting those KPIs within a specific amount of time that you set for yourself, then it's for a reason, right? It might not be the most opportunistic area to enter. It might be that the product is lacking some major issues, or has some major issues. And so that would be the first thing, is setting a time bound. The second thing is making sure that like you're trying to target the right KPIs, or you're trying to soft launch for a very specific reason. For instance, Carson mentioned earlier that you're often doing tech soft launches first to make sure that your game is working properly. Then you're doing ones to test specific product features, and then you might do one where you're testing several types of UA ad creatives to see which ones can scale out. And so depending on which of those that you're in, you have a better idea of like what KPIs you need to reach and how long it should take. And if you don't reach it within that time, then maybe you should reevaluate kind of the key pillar of what's driving that. And then if you need to make tweaks, like I said again earlier, like don't hold that sacred. Make tweaks when they need to be made, or else it's just going to prolong the process.
Okay, thanks. Do you guys, is there anything else that you wanted to cover that we didn't, or I think we're a bit over time, so if not, okay. So thanks again for joining, everyone. If you ask questions that we didn't get to cover, then we'll do our best to answer them over email. Yep. Thanks everyone for joining me, Eric, double Eric, Karsten, and Laurie. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And we just wanted to add another word about everything that's going on in the US right now, that our hearts is with everyone there, and we're looking forward for calmer times and equality. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for having us. It was great. Loved it. And I hope we can do more in the future. And also thank you all for watching and for asking questions and reacting. It's great to see all of you here. I can recognize a lot of names. So hi to everyone I know. And I hope to see all of you on AppTweak very soon. And don't forget that you can try AppTweak for free, of course. and I'd love to chat ASO with you. So just feel free to reach out to me, and we can discuss.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.